afternoon. Hi, everybody. It's a beautiful day. I'm coming to you live from Wildwood Park, which is off of Main Street in Radford. It's one way to get there, and it is a beautiful place, and it's a beautiful day, and I'm having a great day. Um, I had some really good students today. We talked about some great stuff in photography, and also I'm involved in kind of a battle with a bureaucratic system that has a goal to kind of keep everyone from getting what they deserve, it seems like sometimes. Uh, and I think that's a battle I'm going to win, and it makes me so happy. Um, and it might make a difference in my life and in the lives of some people that I care about. So it's a fantastic day. I hope yours is too. Today, let's talk a little bit about ancient Greek art, where we left off the other day. Um, Similar to what we did last week, I'm going to have a slideshow provided for you on D2L, so you can, if you want, you can listen to this narration while you view that show for yourself. As we mentioned before, ancient Greece went through what's considered a peaceful time period. This was after the Greek city-states had banded together to defeat the invading Persian Empire. They were finally able to do so in a decisive naval victory, and the city of Athens was taking up tax money from many other parts of Greece because they had a strong navy, which allowed the Greek people to win this battle. After that war was over, Athens had a lot of that money left, and they used it to launch this building campaign. And a lot of things that were built during this campaign were centers of tourism. So people would come from all over the Western world to see some of these buildings and to take place in things like religious ceremonies dedicated to different gods, and also there were theater productions. The first, what we think of as the first Western theater, was in Athens, Greece, and we'll look at that here in a moment. If you go to slide number 3, what you'll see is called the Acropolis. That is a big rock that juts out of the city of Athens. So you have Greece, and then you have Athens, and in Athens is this area called the Acropolis, or High City. And on that Acropolis are some of the buildings that were made during this time of peace. If you go to slide number 4, that's the Parthenon, dedicated to the goddess Athena, considered by many to be one of the most beautiful buildings in Western history. When the ancient Greeks made these temples, it wasn't so much the way we think of a building today as being something functional, a place to keep out the elements, or a place designed for a specific utilitarian purpose. There was a lot of concern for beauty in these temples, so in a way the temple itself was an offering, and it was like a piece of artwork on a very large scale. The building has a lot of unique characteristics about it. The porch of the building curves to shed rainwater, and it's kind of hard to see from the photograph, but if you measure it out, it does. The columns themselves aren't perfectly straight. There's a technique called entasis, which means that the column swells and then gets smaller. Not sure exactly why the columns are built that way, but it might have something to do with the idea that the temple itself is an organic thing, so it's kind of like the idea of muscle tension, that the column's not perfectly straight. Also, it's hard to see, but the columns tilt in a little bit, so if you extended the lines from them, they would actually meet a couple of miles above the building. Partial reason for this might be optical illusions. So if those columns were perfectly straight, when you viewed it from the front, it would create the optical illusion that they were actually pointed outward. By letting them lean in a little bit, they look perfectly straight, even when viewed from below in the front. Sculpture decorated the Parthenon on the top. In between those triglyphs, which are those decorations that have 3 vertical lines, there were relief sculptures. And then in the pediment, which as you can see was partially destroyed, that's a triangular area over the entrance, there were sculptures there as well, which were high relief, almost completely freestanding but still attached to the wall in the back. Slide number 5 is an artist's conception of what might have originally been inside the Parthenon, which was a 40-foot tall statue of the goddess Athena. And it's believed that her armor was made out of gold and that her skin was made out of ivory. We're pretty sure that something like this existed because we saw images of it on coins and images of it, different artistic conceptions and writings from ancient times. Also notice that this is a massive statue. If you see the people that are standing in the foreground, it gives you some idea of what scale this thing probably was. Sometimes referred to as the treasury of Athens. It's possible that all of that excess tax money went into the treasury, which was located at one point in the Parthenon, and took the form of that gold that you see on that sculpture. It's also believed there was a reflecting pool in front of it that would have been visually very stunning, and also that water would have helped keep that ivory from drying out and cracking. So it's a pretty ingenious design. Also, you notice that the back wall includes columns. If you go to slide number 6, what you'll see is part of a continuous frieze that was on the inside row of columns on the Parthenon. That is different from the one on the outside because it's a different order and it's a different style. On the outside we have the Doric order, which is the saucer-shaped capitals, and the sculptures that are separated by those triglyphs on that inner band. It's continuous. That's a tradition that comes from the Ionian people, which was a more eastern part of Greece, and they probably included that as part of a compromise because they took tax money from all over Greece to build it. They included a reference to the Ionic style. The subject matter of that frieze has been up for some debate. Most people believe it had something to do with a ceremony that was performed yearly to honor the goddess Athena. There was a much bigger ceremony that took place every 4 years that would draw a large crowd. And once again, these buildings on the Acropolis were in a way tourist destinations. So anytime you could get people to come to your country or your city, you could get them to bring money with them, and so it became a big economic thing as well. The next slide, number 7, shows the exterior of the building, and as you can see, it has been heavily damaged. The way that damage happened was actually in the 1600s. Now keep in mind that we're talking about the Greek, what's considered the Greek Golden Age, which is around 500 BCE when these buildings were made, but they have a very long history that kept going. At one point in the 1600s, the Ottoman Turks had control of this area, and they had used the Parthenon to store weapons and ammunition. They were fighting the Venetians, who were in boats off the coast of Athens, who were actually shooting rockets at the Parthenon as part of the battle. One of the rockets apparently scored a direct hit, and all that powder that was stored inside blew up, and it blew the roof off of the building and also knocked down some of the columns and created the damage that you see there. Slide number 8 shows you some of the original roofing tiles that were found in the immediate vicinity. Those are ceramic, and so each tile was a handmade ceramic piece. Slide number 9 shows you a rusty piece of metal. Around 1900, there was an attempt by an architect named Balanos, and that's 1900 CE, which was just a couple hundred years ago, attempted to restore the Parthenon, and in doing so actually caused a lot more damage because he would take parts of the columns that didn't really fit together and try to make them fit, and he would also hold them in place with these iron bars, which, because the columns didn't really fit together, water would get inside there, corrode it, and then it would cause the marble to crack and be damaged. So that conservation effort actually caused a lot more damage. In slide number 10, you can see part of the Parthenon's long history. At one point during the medieval period, it became a Christian church, and then after the Ottoman Turks had taken over, it became a Islamic mosque. And so part of those structures are still there in the Parthenon, and you can see that it did have a very long, involved history. Slide number 11 is a shot from what it looks like in the Parthenon now. And oh, by the way, I took a lot of these photos myself, so that's pretty cool. I was glad to have the opportunity to do that. There's this massive reconstruction effort that's still going on today, and part of that's just to try to fix the damage that Bolanos did. It's not the goal to restore the Parthenon to what it was during the Greek Golden Age, but just to give people a pretty good idea of what it looked like before it was heavily damaged. Slide number 12 is a piece of marble that's being worked on and crafted to replace a piece that's come down. They have very skilled stoneworkers that are doing this, and in slide number 13 you can see how the old stone, which has turned gold over time, is met with the new marble and how precisely it's been fit together. These are very highly skilled people that do that. Slide number 14 mentions a British ambassador named Lord Elgin, and that created a controversy that's still going on today. The British ambassador, Lord Elgin, was a big admirer of ancient Greek artwork, and so when the Ottoman Turks were in control of the Parthenon and the Acropolis, and a lot of Greece for that matter, this British ambassador went to the Ottoman authorities and wanted to take some of those sculptures back home to England to put them in a museum. So they worked out a deal, and Lord Elgin and his team proceeded to try to remove the sculptures from the Parthenon. And when doing so, they actually dropped some of them on the ground and they bust them into 1,000 pieces. So here are these priceless artifacts from 500 BC. Just, oops, I dropped it, and it's busted on the ground and it's gone forever. Some of those that did survive are still in a museum in London today, and the Greek people want those back. Well, of course they do. The argument that the British use is that if we wouldn't have taken them, they wouldn't have been safe. They would have been destroyed. The argument of the Greeks is that that's part of their cultural heritage, and it was taken away due to imperialism that had nothing to do with the Greek people's consent, and that they should be returned. Sometimes you still hear about that on the news, especially with the Greek economy being in kind of bad shape the way it is today. Slide number 15 shows you a couple of those sculptures referred to sometimes as the Elgin marbles. You'll notice that the hands, the arms and the heads are missing. That could have been because of damage taking them down, or it could have been damage that was done at an earlier date. Perhaps the heads were knocked off intentionally by these different groups as they occupied the Parthenon and considered the older religions to be pagan in nature. Let's see. Slide number 16 gives you an artist's conception of what those sculptures might have originally looked like. Keep in mind that this was in a triangular pediment, so just like in McConnell Library, the triangular entrance that was over top of the columns and the temple doors. It's believed that on the entrance, because of the dedication to Athena, that the story that took place that's told about these sculptures is actually the birth of Athena. Now, Athena was a goddess, so as you can imagine, just like some of the other goddesses or gods that we've talked about, she may have had kind of a strange birth. According to the story, Zeus, who was the king of the Olympian gods, had many wives, and one of his wives, at one point, he became displeased with her, so he devoured her. He just ate her. He didn't realize that she was pregnant at the time, and that was his child. So after the child comes of age, and it's time for her to be born, she's still inside Zeus's body. So one day Zeus gets this terrible headache, which is weird for gods because they're not supposed to get headaches. And he doesn't know what to do about it. There was a blacksmith god who you see pictured there named Hephaestus. He's the guy holding the axe. And he says, I know how to fix it. I'll hit you in the head with this axe, and then that'll cure your headache. So he does. And when he does that, out pops Athena. And she's fully grown, and she's dressed in battle armor. And was a goddess of wisdom, but was also a goddess of battle. She had a lot of different roles within the Greek belief. If you look at the body language of these figures, they're all reacting in surprise at this miraculous thing that happened. but there's no emotion on the faces. That's a very important quality of ancient Greek art. There was a ancient Greek belief that is involved with the idea of humanism, that human problems can be solved through rational thought, and that emotion is something that reduces us to our baser instincts and should be avoided. So the ideal human to the ancient Greek artists was someone who didn't have any emotion on their face, and that's the reason that the sculptures look that way. Again, this is an artist's rendition of what that sculpture might have looked like. We don't really know because it was destroyed a long time ago. In slide number 17, you see the inside of the new Acropolis Museum, which was just recently opened in Greece. Part of the reason for making the new Acropolis Museum is that air pollution in Greece is really bad right now, and it has been for a while. And the air pollution actually starts to damage the marble of the remaining buildings and the sculpture, so that they wanted to move them inside to keep them safe. It's a neat museum, and the museum itself is laid out just like the Parthenon. It's the same length and width. So as you walk around it and you look at these statues, you're actually seeing them in the same format that you would if you walked around the Parthenon. And when you look out the large windows, you can actually see the Acropolis very close by. So it's a really neat museum. The columns that you see are spaced out at the same rate as the actual columns. So it's a very authentic sort of museum experience. The figures that you see on display here on slide 17, you'll notice that some are marble and some look like really kind of ugly plaster casts. Those ugly plaster casts are copies of the Elgin marbles that are still in London. So in a way, this is a message from the Greek people saying, okay, we have a safe place to put these now. You have no more excuses. Return our property to us, which in my opinion would be the right thing to do, but so far London has no signs of doing so. Also, the original continuous Ionic frieze that was on the interior of the Parthenon has been moved indoors, and so you can see some of those relief sculptures, and if you look closely again, some of those are ugly plaster copies, and you guessed it, the originals are still in England. Slide number 20 shows an interesting aspect of the museum. Some of the areas of the floor are glass so that you can look down through it, and the reason for that is that there's still excavations that are going on underneath the museum. This place is very rich in ancient artifacts, so you get to watch that process as part of your visit. Slide 21, once again, that far shot of the Acropolis, and right now we're going to look at the little building that you see, which is located on the left side of that big rock, and slide number 22 shows you that in more detail. That's called the Erechtheion. That's named after Erechtheus, who according to Greek myth was the first king of Athens, and he wasn't just a person, he was actually part snake, which makes him kind of interesting. The way this creature was born is that we know Athena, who we just talked about, and we know the blacksmith god Hephaestus. He was the guy that hit Zeus in the head with the axe. Hephaestus was really in love with Athena and just decided that he had to have her. And so he would force himself upon her on occasion. And on one of these occasions, she would always fight him off because she wasn't just wise, she was also a warrior goddess. So she was able to fight off Hephaestus, but one drop of his sperm landed on her leg, so she flicks it off. And when it hits the earth, this thing is created, and that thing is the half-snake, first king of Athens. If you go back up to the slide that had that big 40-foot statue of Athena, you'll notice there's a snake there by her shield, and that's why that snake is a symbol of Athena, and you see those two working together sometimes. This is an interesting building. It's considered an Ionic building, and if you look at the capitals, which is the top part of the columns, you'll see that scroll shape, which identifies it as Ionic. And it had this porch with these columns that are actually shaped like women, as if they're carrying the porch on top of their heads. These are referred to sometimes as caryatid columns, and you'll see that word and how to spell it in slide 23. The originals are in a museum to keep them safe. Those are copies that were very carefully made to give people an idea of what that originally looked like. Slide 24 is a hole on the porch of the Erechtheion, and according to Greek myth and legend, that's where Zeus became angry one day and threw a lightning bolt, and it went through the ceiling. And then in slide 25, there's a corresponding hole that's in the floor, and all that ties in to Greek myth and legend. Hey, we call it myth, but keep in mind that a myth to us at one point was a person's religion, and it was a belief that they took very seriously. And religion wasn't just something that you did on Sunday. It was very much a part of everyone's daily life, and it included the public, and it included the government as well. If you're standing on the Acropolis, on that big rock, and you look down over the side, you'll see what's in slide number 26, which is considered the first Western theater, and that's the theater of Dionysus. And many of the festivals that were held here were dedicated to Dionysus, who was the god of wine and the god of hedonism, in a way, the idea that life is made to be lived and enjoyed and experienced. These early plays started off with just one actor, and then there were two actors and a chorus, and people would come to see this. And it wasn't just entertainment; it was also part of a religious ceremony. Slide 27 shows you what the top of the Parthenon looks like today. It's been cleared down to the bedrock. This was a tough decision to make because this has centuries and centuries and centuries of history on top of it. Lots of different eras, lots of different people that were in control of this place. At one point, the Greek government decided that the Golden Age, around 500 BC, was the most important, and they pulled everything else away, and they damaged a lot of historical knowledge when they did that. And that's what you see today, is that bare bedrock. Slide number 28 is another example of the way the ancient Greeks depicted human bodies. Most of the ancient Greek sculptures are actually made out of bronze that were cast using the lost wax process that we talked about in the sculpture chapter. The Romans were very fond of those sculptures and often made marble copies of them. So that's what you see in slide 28, is a marble copy of that Greek bronze original. The bronze sculptures, very few of those survived because bronze is a valuable material, and in times of war, which seemed to happen pretty often, shields and swords became more important than artwork, and so many of those were melted down and used to make weapons. Slide number 29, once again, a Roman copy of a Greek original. The original is probably in bronze. This is referred sometimes, the sculpture itself, as the canon of proportions, meaning that this sculpture set out rules in a way for the way Greeks were to depict the human body. At first glance, this looks realistic because it's a sculpture of a person and it looks like a person, but it's not realistic. This body is actually based on mathematics. So the width of the shoulder is based on the size of the head, the length of the torso based on the width of the shoulders, the length of the arms and legs are all based on mathematical concepts. So no real person actually looks like this. This was the Greek mathematical ideal of a perfect human, a godlike human. If you had the right certain kind of genetics and you started working with a trainer by the time you hit puberty, and a nutritionist, and worked out every day and did all these things, you might come pretty close to this, but it's not realistic. It's based on math, not on real people. We think that the proportions you see set forth in this statue were actually used as a rule to make other Greek statues, again, to attain that godlike Greek idea of perfection. Beauty is a very important concept to the Greeks, and also they were very big about knowing which artist created which artwork because of that interest in beauty. They thought it to be one thing that made humans unique and one thing that was very important to humanity. The idea that through pursuing beauty and perfection that humans could actually make their life better without completely relying on the power of a higher being like a god to do that for them. We see that come up again in the 1400s in Europe, and we call that time the Renaissance, which is French for rebirth, referring to that rebirth in ancient Greek ideals. Once again, no emotion on the face of that sculpture. 30, another example of that Greek idea of beauty. You'll notice when you look at the way the figure is standing that all of the weight is shifted onto one leg. That pose is known as contrapposto, which just means weight shift. And it was a technique that we think was developed by the Greeks in order to make that figure look more dynamic and more realistic. So with the weight shifted back, you can really get a sense of the mass of that person, the idea that you have a person that's trying to achieve balance. It's an exaggeration of the way humans move and the way they stand. Contrapposto. Slide 31 tells you a little about Hellenistic art. This is what we consider the last era of Greek artwork. It's called Hellenistic because the Greeks refer to their country as Hellas. We call it Greece, they call it Hellas. So Hellenistic is Greek-like. And Hellenistic art is considered to be the time period in Greek art where these ideas started spreading across Europe, and a lot of that had to do with Alexander the Great, who was actually Macedonian, who spread Greek culture throughout a very wide range, including the Middle East and parts of Africa. Hellenistic art also started to move away from that idea that humans should not have any emotion, that humans should just base their entire life on science and on rationality. So we start to see more emotion portrayed in this time period known as Hellenistic art. If you go to the next slide, slide 32, that sculpture is referred to sometimes as a dying Gaul. And a Gaul during Greek times was someone that lived around Germany or around that area of Europe, sometimes referred to as the Gauls. If you look carefully, you can see that this person appears to have been wounded and may actually be dying, and you can see one of the wounds depicted and blood rushing from it. There's an interest in the drama of this moment and the emotion that you didn't really see during the classical period. Also, in case I forgot to mention it, the Greeks really liked to depict males as being fully nude. They considered the male body to be a very naturally beautiful thing, so most of these males that you see depicted in sculpture are nude. There were times with the Roman copies that came later that is covered up, especially if it was to be placed in an even later church in the Middle Ages, like in a Catholic church. Sometimes there would be a fig leaf or there would be a piece of plant that was placed in front of that male genitalia that people aren't allowed to see. Slide 33, sometimes referred to as Old Market Woman. Also, it's about emotion, and it's also about a person that you might not see depicted during the Greek classical age. This is a person that someone witnessed walking down the street, so it's not a god and it's not a general or a hero from Greek history. It's just a normal person and different from the classical age. And with slide 34, another image. This one is about gods and mythology, but look at the faces. It has high emotion that you wouldn't have seen during the classical age. Let's see if I can think of the name of this one. Laocoon. That was his name. That was a Trojan priest. So according to the writings of the epic poet Homer, at one point there was a war between the Greeks and a city called Troy, and those people were referred to as the Trojans. Laocoon was a Trojan priest, and he could see into the future, and he had these extra normal abilities. So at one point he has a vision, and the vision is that the Trojans should never accept gifts from the Greeks. Well, the story goes on, and if you recall, it's a pretty well-known story about the Trojan War. The Greeks at one point build this giant wooden horse, and they offer it as a peace offering. And so they leave it outside these gates of Troy, because the city of Troy was surrounded by these gates and these walls that couldn't be climbed and couldn't be overtaken. So it was frustrating to the Greeks. So they make this giant wooden horse, and they pretend like it's a gift, and then the Greek soldiers hide inside of it. That night, when the Trojans take the Trojan horse into their city behind the gates, the Greeks sneak out. They open the gates, and then Troy is sacked, and the Greeks win that war. Laocoon had a vision that something like that was going to happen, and so he started to warn people about it. This made Athena furious, because Athena, of course, was on the side of the Greeks. So she sends her buddy the snake to go take care of it, and then this giant serpent goes to Laocoon's house, and it strangles him and his sons. And his sons here are presented kind of miniature adults. They don't really have the features that children would have. They're like adults, but their bodies are just smaller, and they still have that Greek godlike musculature and skeletal structure. Laocoon, according to the story, was a guy that was in his 70s. He was an old man, but here he still has that very vibrant godlike body. And there's high emotion on the faces, terror and agony, as these people are killed by the snake, which puts it nicely into that Hellenistic category. That seemed like a good place to stop for today. I think it does. I hope you guys get a chance to get out and enjoy this beautiful weather. It's quite lovely. Keep up with the reading. Keep up with the reading. This is all in chapters 15 and 16. We'll have test number 4 coming up, most likely on Wednesday. We'll talk about it more then, and I'll try to put up a announcement on D2L about the test. And as always, there'll be a study guide up there for you guys to look at as well. Have a wonderful weekend, and if you get a chance, make something, or at least go look at what other people are making, and maybe that'll inspire you. Find ways to do the right thing. Find ways to make a positive difference for yourself and for people that you care about. And you'll be surprised at how good it makes you feel sometimes. Peace. I'll see you later.